Well, let's get things started here. I would like to introduce to everybody our guest speaker for January, our first event of 2023, Beth Smith, SRWA, who's with Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District. She's been there for 5 years. Beth is very active in the IRWA. I first met her when she was the chair of Region 5. I've had the pleasure to get to know her during those responsibilities, and then at other IRWA forums and at the international conferences. So if you haven't got to a forum, there's one coming up in April in French Lick, Indiana. So I encourage you guys to possibly consider attending that. And at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Beth. So if you don't have any questions, we ask you to mute your microphone, and then you can ask questions during the presentation or wait until the after. I see Mr. Gordon McNair is now with us. That's awesome. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Beth.
Okay, thank you so much, Johnny. So like Johnny said, I work for the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. I'm the real estate specialist there. Our department is comprised of 2 people, myself and my supervisor, and we handle pretty much all of the real estate for the district, aside from things like appraisals and title searches and that kind of thing. So I end up doing a little of a lot of things, or a lot of things. And that's kind of how I feel about the Burnham Canal that I'm going to talk with you about today. My part in it was comparatively small, but necessary. And it was pretty wide ranging. So with that, I'm going to start here. I feel like in order to kind of give the full story, we kind of have to go back in time a little bit. First off, this is what the Burnham Canal looks like today. Well, this picture was taken maybe 10 years ago, but nothing too significant has changed. This is looking from the west to the east. And so the Burnham is about 3,000 linear feet long and 120 feet wide. It's located on the south side of the Menomonee River Valley in the Walker's Point neighborhood. As you can see, adjacent uses are primarily industrial and commercial, but we have redevelopment happening in Walker's Point east of the canal and moving in the direction of the canal. The canal has highly contaminated sediments in it, and a remediation project has been started. So that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. And prior to the remediation project, the depth of the canal, it ranged from, it was pretty shallow at the west end, maybe 7 feet, and was 21 feet at its deepest. So just kind of a quick, this is an aerial of the city of Milwaukee, and the Burnham Canal is in the little blue square. Here's a little bit more of a close-up of the canal. It's the southern waterway. You can kind of see the fork there, which will become important over the next couple of slides. So now I want to go back. Let's go back to pre-1848. And the reason why I say pre-1848 is this is the original property subdivision. And you can kind of see the fork. I'm just kind of I know this is maybe hopefully not too irritating, flipping back and forth, but you can see how the river in that area kind of split. So this map is the partition of the northwest quarter of Section 32, Town 7 North, Range 22 East, Town of Milwaukee, and Territory of Wisconsin. So Wisconsin became a state in 1848. So we know that this was put together sometime prior to then. So this was in the Menomonee River Valley, and much of the valley was a swamp. And it had a rich and diverse natural habitat and was filled with game, fish, wild rice, kind of, you name it, anything that would go well with a more riverine area. It was generally pristine prior to the settlers arriving, let's say. Native Americans were settled in this area. And the final 6 miles of the river meandered through the valley before meeting up with the Milwaukee River about a couple hundred feet west of the lake. And then after the confluence, they go out to Lake Michigan. In the late 1860s, the Menomonee Improvements Plan was conceived of, and it was a plan that proposed to fill the Menomonee River marshland areas and create a center for industry. Milwaukee is sometimes known as the machine shop of the world, and this was basically ground zero for that. So a network of roads, canals, and slips were designed and built to provide greater access from the inland areas out to Lake Michigan. So we go from Mr. McMartin, and I'm going to flip here just so that you can kind of see. So here's, Peter McMartin. Hopefully you can see my pointer. Here's his 40 acres right here. And then he subdivides a part of that into these lots and blocks. Now, what's a little interesting about this is the canal is identified on the very north end of this subdivision, but it was actually constructed more to the south. It was built essentially in the majority of blocks 160, 161, and 162. And I had to figure that out because of some historical research that I did, which was one of sort of the many things that I worked on for this project. So then next up, we have this rendering of Milwaukee in 1872. And we've got the Burnham Canal constructed. It was started in 1870 and finished in 1872. It was named for the Burnham brothers, who were engaged in brick making near the canal. They were actually engaged in the Cream City brick making. Water was a particularly efficient way to transport the bricks because of their weight and their mass, and because of the relative lack of roads in the area and the cost associated with constructing roads. It was comparatively easier and cheaper to construct canals than roads or railroads. There were actually occasions where railroad tracks would be laid, and the next morning folks would come out and they will have sunk into the swamp. So they would have to go and put more fill and then reconstruct the additional trackage. So you didn't have that to worry about quite as much when dredging a canal. So the contamination unfortunately started in this area almost immediately. Didn't take long for the canal to really suffer from the commercial activities that were going on around it. The adjacent uses included the Pfister and Vogel Tannery, one of the Pabst breweries, a distillery, slaughterhouses, lumber yards, and those kinds of uses. So the canal was used not only to get products to and from market, but as a dumping ground as well. Wastes that were dumped included spent grain, manure, sawdust, and other organic wastes. The canal had no natural water source upstream to carry garbage downstream, so what was dumped didn't go very far. In 1874, at this point, it was just 2 years in use. We had newspaper reports that the South Menomonee and the Burnham Canal is considered part of the South Menomonee as a sickening atmosphere with an intolerable stench of its waters. A city inspector was sent to investigate and found the water to be thick, inky, and putrid, and in a state of violent commotion. By 1880s, things had not much improved. According to the Milwaukee Daily News, the city, or excuse me, the Burnham Canal was considered the most polluted water in the city. I have some newspaper clippings because I'm a little bit of a geek that way. So I just sort of highlighted, you know, we've got it being referred to as a stink hole, this word ebullition, which is to be like bubbling or churning or boiling. Here we have, again, the most polluted water in the city. Burnham's Canal is pronounced a noisome reservoir. Mosquitoes are reported thick enough to cut solid with a jackknife. I mean, I think that's maybe a little bit of hyperbole, but, you know, maybe not. And then this last one, there was an Alderman Wood who, this wasn't the only sort of article that talked about how unhappy he was with the Burnham, but I feel like this was kind of the biggest or the most illustrative of that. He brought a bottle of the water from the canal to the committee meeting and encouraged everybody to smell it. He, you know, declared the channel a nuisance and recommended condemnation by the board. I should have kept the next line in the clipping. Nothing further of interest, and the board adjourned. So apparently Mr. Wood did not get his way. One other interesting thing about this is that the city leaders contemplated drilling artesian wells in order to try to flush the canal. This is sort of a whole separate tangential story, so I'll try to make it brief. The Milwaukee River has a flushing station that's sort of north of the downtown area, and that was put into service in the late 1880s. At this point, they had already conceived of this idea of bringing fresh lake water in to flush the river, and that did work for the Milwaukee River, but they felt it wouldn't work for the Burnham Canal and the South Menomonee because the lake water that was the closest that would have been available to them to pump it was just about as contaminated and gross as the water that was.
You understand what I got you, or you don't understand why they're having issues with it?
Uh-oh. Patrick, was that for me, or should you be on mute?
My bad, I should be, sorry.
Okay, all right, no worries. So anyway, that was where they thought that, you know, maybe drilling these wells, that had worked, that idea of the wells had worked on the KK River, but it's unclear. I wasn't able to determine from additional research whether that, whether they were able to make that well idea happen. So, oh, question? So from the 1880s through the late 20th century, the canal doesn't make the news too much. We've got some evolution of uses. The Canadian Pacific Railroad, the Muskego Yard, is just on the north side of the properties that are north of the canal. So many of the uses relied both on rail and water commerce. And you can kind of see that. I do end up coming back to this picture, and you'll kind of see why at the end. But here we have some, the railroad tracks are here off to the left. We've got cement silos in a couple of locations, and then some semi-truck parking. There are more silos that you can't quite see, sort of off a little bit more in the distance as well. So the cement factories, there were coal yards, industrial recycling facilities. They all contributed to the continuation and accumulation of contamination in the canal. By the 1980s, we started hearing reports or seeing reports of fish die-offs, and that was believed to be caused by lack of oxygen. And in a couple of cases, they thought that maybe there was some sort of precipitating event, like a spill or something along those lines, but they were never able to really pinpoint what it was. But I think at one point it was like 100,000 gizzard shad, which is a rough fish, were dead or dying in the canal. So pretty sad day, according to the news reports. So what's all in the canal now? So through testing, we've learned that there are heavy metals, including cadmium, chromium, copper, mercury, silver, zinc, kind of the whole, all the bad ones. And then also PAHs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are commonly found in motor oil, also are the result of incomplete combustion of fuels. A wire reclamation furnace owned and operated by Miller Compressing, one of the adjacent owners, was located a short distance from the west terminus of the canal, and contributed significantly to the copper and PAH levels in that western end of the canal. So why are these harmful? So these contaminants are a harm to benthos, and benthos are the flora and fauna found either on the bottom or the bottom sediments of a body of water. They I'm pretty sure that it was the benthos that were causing the violent commotion and the churning, because they were eating the organic runoff from back in the 1800s, because their food sources are algae and organic runoff. So in a way, they were kind of helping to, clean up the mess early on. And then larger organisms feed on benthos. So because of the low oxygen levels and the contaminants, the benthos is damaged in the canal, and so we basically see it as it's a dead zone. Now, what I found to be interesting is that there was a statement in one of the reports that the Burnham Canal is not considered to be a harm to public health. But in reading a little bit more about that, the reason why is because it's not really being used by the public. So it's not considered a harm because it's not being used. So I think that if people were going down there and swimming or, actually accessing the canal, they would probably find it to be more of a harm to public health. So how did we end up with this project? Miller Compressing recognized and agreed that the contamination from the western terminus to the 11th Street Bridge needed to be addressed, and they agreed to pay for the remediation. This process was all part of that western end of the canal being declared a Superfund site in 2008. And the remediation options that were considered included dewatering, dredging, capping, or some combination of those. So neither dewatering nor dredging were considered to be feasible. The dewatering option, which would be where you would sort of dam the end of the canal and drain it, and then dig those contaminated sediments out, excuse me. The dock walls of the canal in some locations are not believed to be structurally sound. So the water helps to keep those walls in place. So if the pressure from the water was gone, there's concern that we could see some collapse or worse. Dredging also didn't seem like the best option, just because digging those contaminants up would sort of disperse them more into the water. So ultimately the decision was made to cap the contamination, and the EPA approved of that plan in 2011. It's around this point that MMSD got involved. So this drawing is sort of the greater Milwaukee River, Menomonee River area. And the purple shading denotes the Milwaukee estuary area of concern. An area of concern is defined as a geographic area designated by the parties. And in this case, it's US and Canada, because these are AOCs associated with the Great Lakes, where a significant impairment of beneficial uses has occurred as a result of human activities at the local level. So the Burnham Canal, as you can see here, is part of that AOC. So MMSD and partners too numerous to list are committed to doing what's necessary in order to clean up the AOC. So as part of the AOC cleanup effort planning process, MMSD proposed a second project, and that is to cap the segment of the canal from 11th Street Bridge to the east, and then ultimately construct a wetland over the entire capped canal. Just a few more details about the chosen alternative. The plan there is to place clean fill over the top of the contaminated sediments. The cap ranges in depth because the depth of the canal ranges. Essentially, the goal was to fill the canal to a depth of about 6 feet, so that the water is about 6 feet deep. The existing settlements are unstable and likely to compress under the weight of the sediments that are being placed, which in some cases is up to 15 feet. So after the installation of the initial cap, and the caps have been installed, I'll talk about that in a minute, we're now in a waiting period to see if the sediments compress, and if so, will we need to add a little bit more fill before constructing the proposed wetland. So a little information about the real estate acquisition work. I have a little schematic here. So the Miller Compressing handled acquiring the real estate needs for their cap. This is the 11th Street Bridge, so they handled everything west of there. So MMSD's section is here from the 11th Street Bridge to essentially the high-rise bridge here of I-94, I-43. So this was sort of a conceptual idea for how we would provide the construction areas needed in order to do the wetland base. So we've got a 50-foot temporary easement on the south side of the canal, a staging area here, which would provide laydown room for the contractor, and then a 10-foot easement along the rest of the north side of the canal. So, excuse me. Let's see. Oh, I got ahead of myself. I apologize. We had an earlier phase of real estate that required us to do some groundwork for the DNR's requirements for putting the fill in the canal. And that was, we needed to get two agreements with each property owner. The first was that they needed to agree to allow MMSD to act as their agent for what we refer to as a Chapter 30 permit, which is filling in wetlands. And then the second was to obtain a permanent easement from them that would allow placement of the fill in the canal. So fortunately, that phase one of the real estate went pretty smoothly. It did take a fair amount of explaining and, talking to the property owners about, what we were trying to do. And this isn't really something that any of us do every day. So it was a new thing to work on for all of us. So then that takes us to phase two, which is the actual what we need in order to build the project and what would be on the right-of-way plat. So as I talked about before, this was sort of the conceptual idea for the construction. And so in that, we did end up, and I'm going to skip ahead. So here's the right-of-way plat, which is a little different than how the lines were drawn on the conceptual plan. And essentially what we did was we revised the temporary easements on these two properties. This is parcel 3 and this is parcel 2. If we had acquired that original 50-foot easement, it would have resulted in essentially wiping out an entire outside storage area for one of the property owners, and then would have eliminated access to semi bays and truck bays on the north side of this property here. So after quite a bit of kind of going back and forth with the designers, we were able to get those changes made, and then everybody was agreeable, which we were very relieved about. And then we also needed to acquire some limited water rights. And I'm going to talk a little bit more at length about that in a minute. And then lastly, we had a temporary relocation of this business here. And then also a property management issue. We had some homeless folks that were camping in the temporary construction easement that we acquired from the city in this location. So after quite a bit of coordination between the city and the county homeless advocacy group that works with unsheltered people, we were able to get those folks into a better situation than living out in the adjacent to the canal. So one thing that we wound up dealing with on this project that I've dealt with sort of conceptually before, but not in practice, is the idea of like navigability and water rights and that kind of thing. So this is a map of the Burnham Canal, the South Menomonee Canal, and the white area with the dotted lines is what's considered to be a navigable waterway. This is directly from the NOAA website, and it's actually a little bit out of date, but there was not an updated one that was available. So at one time, the Burnham Canal was actually navigable all the way to the west terminus. And it was able to do that because this bridge here at 11th Street was a swing bridge. It pivoted in the middle. So ships were able to get by when the bridge was open. And then in 1984, the city of Milwaukee wanted to replace that swing bridge with a fixed span. So this end of the canal was delisted from the navigable waterways, the federal navigable waterways list. Then there's another bridge, a railroad bridge in this location here. And it is an elderly bridge. Here, I've got a couple pictures. And I apologize that these aren't better pictures. The bridge, you can see it kind of here in the background. And then this here. Now, this is kind of an unusual design of a bridge. It's what's referred to as a bobtail bridge. And it opens from one side and it swings. So it's, and I believe that this bridge was built in the late 1800s based on the research that I've done. So in the, let's say, 2010 timeframe, it became more and more expensive for the railroad to continue to to maintain and continue to open the bridge safely. So what they wanted to do then was replace it with a fixed span, the way the city had done at 11th Street. But in order to do that, they would need to get the property owners between 11th Street and the railroad bridge to sign off on their navigability and water rights to that commercial water-based commerce. So let's see. I put the text in here to show. So the water rights that were acquired by Canadian Pacific were not in perpetuity. So the way it reads, the rights granted herein by grantor shall continue in effect for so long as the rail bridge or subsequent replacement thereof remains in place and restricts the passage of water traffic beneath it. As used in this paragraph, removal shall mean the elimination of the rail bridge with the intent by grantee not to replace it, and shall not mean the absence of a rail bridge for reasonable periods as may occur during the subsequent replacement, maintenance, or reconstruction of the bridge. So by MMSD filling in the canal on that stretch where these property owners would continue to have the right in the event, very unlikely but not impossible chance that that rail bridge would go away, we're making it so that they would lose that tiny chance of right sometime in the future. So as a result, we needed to acquire that remaining tail end of the water rights that the Canadian Pacific didn't acquire. So those water rights we did acquire in perpetuity. The wording that we used, grantor agrees to convey and quitclaim to grantee the exclusive right to prevent, prohibit, and exclude the docking or interchange with water vessels along that portion of property abutting the Burnham Canal in the event the Soo Line Railroad, Soo Line was the railroad that was acquired by Canadian Pacific, on the east end of the canal is removed. The granting of these rights is perpetual. So by having everybody sign off on that, we now own those rights, so we don't have to worry that by filling the canal, someone is going to come later and be like, you've deprived me of that stick in the bundle. What I was also grateful for is that everybody recognized that the unlikeliness of that railroad bridge being removed meant that there was not a lot of money tied to those rights that we needed to acquire, and we were able to acquire them for a nominal amount. Okay, so we've gotten the real estate acquired and we can move on to construction. So here's the overview of who handled what areas of construction, and this is for replacing the cap. So the west section of the canal here was completed by Miller Compressing in 2021. And then the east section here that was done by MMSD, they mobilized in spring of last year and completed the work in October. The first part of the project involved installing a cutoff wall at the plane of the west right-of-way edge of the high-rise bridge. So I've got a couple pictures here that kind of show the crane and the various equipment is all on a barge out in the canal. And then unfortunately, everything is all sort of blended in here, but this is they're driving sheet pile wall into the canal. So that's the cutoff wall that'll be there to keep the sediments in the canal, and then also for the fill that's going in, it'll be the wall will hold the fill. And then there's little railroad bridge in the background. And then this is just a little bit more of a close-up, and unfortunately you can't see it much better on that side, but those were some interesting days that they were working out there to see how that process worked, because they also had people in the water as well. About 3 weeks after I took these pictures, I got a call from Megan Dressel, the construction project manager, and telling me that divers had found a boat, a sunken boat in the canal. And I was like, wait a minute, Megan, what? They found what? And so it was on the south side of the canal, just kind of sitting upright, leaning against the side of the dock wall. But nobody really knew anything about the boat, what it was, where it came from, how long it was there. So I jokingly say real estate to the rescue, and not exactly. But what I did do after Megan called was I went out and I talked with the adjacent owners to see if they knew anything about a boat that might have sank. and no one knew anything about it. The reason why this was important is that if that shipwreck, depending on how old it was, it could have had historic implications, which could really, it could have stopped the project. So then the Coast Guard came, they brought their, a remote operated submarine vehicle to try to identify the boat, get a little more information about it. And unfortunately, the ROV got hung up in some rigging that was on the boat. And because of the low visibility, they weren't able to get the ROV unstuck. So truly, it was the Milwaukee Police Department dive team to the rescue. They came out and they wanted the Coast Guard was operating the ROV from the north side of the canal, but the dive team wanted to mobilize from the south side of the canal because that's where the ROV was hung up. But they weren't able to access that because the properties are all security fenced. So fortunately, I was able to reach the owner of the property that was the preferred staging area. He was able to open the gate remotely, and the dive team was able to get onto the property so they could stage and get the ROV freed. In the end, it was determined that whatever that boat was not historically significant. So the project resumed with no significant delays. I've added these slides sort of last minute because a friend of mine who I ran through with this was like, well, tell me more about the construction. How did you guys make that happen? So this is an overview, an aerial of the canal when the work was underway. So you can kind of see here, we've got some operations going on here and here. And then here's a little zoomed in so you can see it a little bit better. So essentially what the contractor did is White Lake out of Michigan. They operated essentially, so they've got piles of the clean fill here, and then a conveyor that would take them out to put it out on a barge. And then I'm probably using the wrong terminology, so forgive me, anybody who has more maritime knowledge than me. And then they would, drag that barge over to a second barge that had an excavator on it. And then that excavator would take the clean fill and put it in a hopper here. And then this was like a little broadcast conveyor that would sort of sprinkle the fill into the water. And as I understand it, this was all done by tracked by GPS, so they would know how much fill was being placed in sort of every location, in any location. Next steps for the project. As I mentioned previously, we believe that those underlying sediments are going to compress. So we're going to be tracking to see if that settling is happening, and if so, how much. Once the cap is stable, and we're hoping that that'll happen within 2 to 5 years, we will begin construction phase 2, which is the Burnham Canal Ecosystem Restoration Project, aka the Future Restored Wetland. The project will add 6.7 acres of wetland habitat to the Milwaukee area. And the specific wetland goals are to create habitat for northern pike and yellow perch. I don't know if you guys all do Friday fish fries the way we do Friday fish fries here in Wisconsin, but yellow perch is my favorite. So there can never be too much yellow perch habitat as far as I'm concerned. Then next, to create varied habitat to benefit other wetland dependent wildlife, such as turtles, birds, and frogs. And then to create water-based recreational opportunities. I have an artist rendering of what we're hoping the canal will look like once the project is established. So you can see we've got some lily pads and some marsh grasses and some sandbars that'll, be there for the birds or for the turtles and that. Then, okay, so you've seen this picture a couple times before, and I'm bringing it back again because they use that picture for the West End rendering. So you can kind of see how, essentially what it looks like today, and then what we're hoping it'll look like once it's been restored. There has been some talk about trying to reestablish wild rice in the Menomonee Valley because it was very, present here originally, but unfortunately the canal, even after the work is done to contain the sediments, they think that the water quality still won't be quite good enough in order to support wild rice, because wild rice really relies on clean, super clean water, I guess. So then in order to make that wetland project happen, we do have some additional real estate work that'll need to that we'll need to do. So we'll have acquisition of additional real estate rights, temporary construction easements. We're not sure yet what those will look like. As I understand it, the wetland is in the design process. So once we know what the design of the wetland is and what the construction needs are, then we'll be able to determine what those construction easements, the construction easement needs will be. And then permanent easements for maintenance access. And then some permanent conservation protection, and that'll be either via deed restriction or conservation easements. Not quite sure just yet. So thus concludes my presentation. I will stop sharing, and if anyone has questions, I would be happy to do my best to answer them. There's a lot of information in there that's not like mine necessarily, so. Oh my gosh, so quiet.
Hey, Beth, in your typical role, how often do you come back to a project after you acquire your rights for your company? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I would say it sort of depends. Like in this case, because the project is, exists over some years, I would say we would sort of revisit that more often. I know, when we acquire things, especially if we own it in fee, part of my job is actually to sort of drive around and make sure that nobody is illegal dumping, or we do have a pretty significant homeless, unsheltered folks living in our sort of watercourse right of way, if you will. So with that, we end up doing outreach with the county housing authority or housing support services. So I don't know, did that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that sometimes when you see like a transportation project, the land agent will come in, acquire the rights, like on Patrick's Purple Line project, pretty much once everything was done, acquired on the acquisition side, there was a little input from the land agent as they moved to the next project.
Right. Yeah. And I know on account of Mike, my supervisor, and I, being the ones who are talking with property owners, a lot of times then, if they have a question, maybe not even about our project, but about something else, a lot of times, well, I know Beth, I'll give her a call. I give a lot of credit to our design engineers. They're very progressive. They do a ton of outreach as well. So it doesn't always fall to us the way it sometimes does on some projects. Let's see, did I see a question?
I think Gordon missed part of the boat.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so there was, divers found a boat that was sunk and abandoned in the canal. We were able to determine that it wasn't historic, it wasn't considered a shipwreck or anything like that. So we didn't have to we were able to just basically fill over the top of it. The Coast Guard came out to try to help us identify it, and their ROV got stuck in some rigging. So then the police dive team had to come and rescue the Coast Guard's ROV. I think the Coast Guard guy was happy that he was on the north side of the canal. He looked like he wanted to be anywhere else but holding on to that little remote control as the dive team was mobilizing 120 feet on the other side of the canal.
I had another question just out of curiosity. With it being a kind of an international project, how much reporting did you have to do back to the Canadian side or the Canadian government, or did somebody else take care of that?
You know, that I'm not sure about that. I know that those AOCs are part of the Great Lakes is it the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, something along those lines. I think that there must be sort of a clearinghouse group that you get those reports back to, and then they share them. Let's see. So no, they didn't recover the sunken boat. Are there goals to add other acres per year to improve water quality and habitat? Yes, we have a pretty aggressive, now I'm not part of it, so I don't know the actual numbers, but MMSD and the Conservation Fund have been working together to acquire parcels of land in primarily the Milwaukee River watershed that have hydric soils. And those are primarily in the counties north of Milwaukee in hopes of keeping that water, preserving the hydric soils or returning the hydric soils to a state where they can absorb the water instead of being tiled and farmed and that kind of thing. So with the idea of the water staying where it falls instead of going to the river and then coming downstream and flooding in Milwaukee. And the public and community response has been positive towards that. We do occasionally get calls like, what's MMSD doing buying property in Washington County or Ozaukee County? But usually when we explain that, it's generally, we're not taking, generally speaking, we're not taking super valuable farmland out of production. We do have a program for that called Working Soils. The Green Seams project is, that the goal there is to acquire properties again with those hydric soils so that the water can sink in up there.
Do we have any other questions for Beth? What was the time frame as far as when you guys got involved until this phase was finished, as far as your department?
Yeah, so it was on our radar for quite a while. The original goal was that I think we were hoping that we would have been maybe starting to construct the wetland already, if not this year, then next year. But with the current timeline, it's out still another 2 to 5 years. So I think that, I started working on Burnham prior to the pandemic, and had most of that acquisition work done. I guess I kind of wrapped it up at the beginning, the early stages of the pandemic.
Okay. Gordon asked if you could share the PowerPoint with the group after.
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Well, if you send that over to me, when I send out the attendings, I'll send that as an attachment.
Okay.
And besides your day job, do you have anything else that you're involved in that might have an event coming up in the near future?
So let's see. Chapter 17 is we're having our spring meeting a little early this year to coincide with the IGC meeting, the IRWA's IGC meeting, which is going to be at the end of February here in Milwaukee. If anybody wants to, we do a nice social hour. So if anybody wants to come up to Milwaukee, to join us for that, you would be welcome. And if you want details, feel free to email me. And then I think like you hit on the spring forum coming up in French Lick, and I guess there's also Patrick and I see Patrick unmuted himself, so he's going to correct me if I don't get on the stick here.
I was gonna tell you, I think Johnny's trying to give you a free plug for the club, and you just keep avoiding it. So
I know, I'm terrible. I am not the PR person for this outfit. So Patrick and I run the eminent domain and right-of-way club on the Clubhouse app, and we are starting our 2023 season a week from tomorrow night with Clint Schumacher of the Eminent Domain podcast. And then we've got a bunch of other great sessions coming up. You can follow us on the various socials, and you can find us on the Clubhouse app, which is the social audio platform. You can find it in any of your Play stores. So if you check us out and you want to come and be our guest, reach out to either Patrick or myself, or if you can think of somebody who you want us to have join us on the club. We're always looking for people to join us and talk smart about right-of-way and other things.
Yeah, there's a link in the email that I send out to the group that has a link to the Clubhouse and to their link. So anybody's interested, it's very interesting to be able to sit down and have a presentation and be able to talk to people across the country and hear their input. So let's all give Beth a big round of applause for being our guest speaker today.
Thank you. Thank you.
We really appreciate it. This is one of the benefits of being in the IRWA, is to be able to see what other people do across the country and maybe get out of your own comfort zone, or in the event that you end up relocating to a different area, there's a lot of opportunities out there other than what you probably originally started in the industry that you're in. It's great to see that we've got some great leaders of the IRWA on here tonight with Dan and Patrick and Beth and Gordon here, and we'd like to thank everybody for spending their lunch hour with us today, and we look forward to seeing everybody in the near future. Thank you guys very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Johnny. Thanks everyone for coming.
Thanks a lot, Johnny. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Johnny.